An 82-year-old man stood at a bank counter on the coldest morning of the year and asked a total stranger to pretend to be his granddaughter for exactly 5 minutes. She said yes without knowing why, never imagining that those 5 minutes would uncover a scheme that had already been stealing pieces of his life for months, or that by the time the snow finally melted, her own life would be tied to his forever. Before we get into it, if you love stories like this one, hit subscribe to Winter Veil and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming. And if this story finds its way into your heart, a like helps us more than you'd think. I have always believed winter doesn't only cover the world in cold, it also strips everything down to what's real, the people who stay, and the promises that survive the frost. This story is about a man who nearly lost everything he loved during the coldest months of his life, and about the stranger whose warmth thawed far more than either of them expected. I hope it warms you the way writing it warmed me. The bank in Maple Hollow was unusually crowded that morning, packed with customers stamping snow from their boots and blowing into their gloved hands. Phones rang behind the counter, and a printer somewhere kept jamming. Near the front of the line, an elderly man in a herringbone overcoat stood with both hands wrapped carefully around an old leather passbook, as if it might slip away from him if he loosened his grip for even a second. His silver hair was combed neatly to one side, and wire-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose. When the young teller asked if anyone had come with him today, his easy smile faltered for just a moment before he answered that he had come alone. Behind him in line, a young woman with copper hair pulled into a loose braid noticed the flicker of something sad cross his face before he could hide it again. Chloe Winters had always been the kind of person who noticed when someone else felt invisible, and something about this stranger's forced calm tugged at her the way a dropped stitch tugs at a sweater. When he slowly turned and found her watching him, he didn't look away in embarrassment the way most people would have. Instead, he studied her for a long second and then asked, in the gentlest voice she had ever heard from someone she'd never met, whether she might pretend to be his granddaughter for just 5 minutes. Chloe blinked, caught completely off guard, and he immediately raised both hands as if to take the request back. He explained quickly that he only needed it until the paperwork was finished, that he wouldn't bother her again after that, and that he understood if the whole idea sounded strange coming from a stranger holding a bank book at 8 in the morning. She studied his face for a moment, the kindness in his pale blue eyes, the complete absence of anything manipulative in them, and something in her simply decided to trust him. She told him okay, and his whole face lit up like a boy who'd just been handed exactly what he wanted for his birthday. He turned back to the counter and told the teller, with unmistakable pride, that his granddaughter had arrived after all. The young woman behind the counter smiled warmly and said that was wonderful, and just like that the tension in the line seemed to dissolve, replaced by soft smiles, and one woman nearby who whispered to her husband that it was the sweetest thing she'd seen all week. 10 minutes later, whatever business he'd needed to finish was done, and the two of them stepped out into the cold together. On the sidewalk, with snow drifting lazily past the streetlights, Chloe finally asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue the entire time, wanting to know why he'd really needed her. He looked down at the passbook in his hands for a long moment before answering that some things were simply easier when people believed someone was waiting for you. He smiled again, but this time the smile couldn't quite cover the sadness underneath it, and Chloe found herself wondering what an 82-year-old man could possibly be so afraid of that he needed a stranger to stand beside him at a bank counter. She noticed he had no car waiting and no ride coming, and when she asked, he admitted with a small shrug that he usually just walked, even though the bus stop was nearly gone for the season and his house was a good 20 minutes away through the snow. Without really deciding to, she found herself falling into step beside him, ignoring his protest that he'd already asked enough of her for one morning. He introduced himself as Edwin Carraway, a retired history teacher who had spent 40 years explaining the Civil War to bored 14-year-olds. And when she teased that he'd probably forgotten more history than she would ever learn, he laughed and admitted he mostly just forgot where he left his glasses these days. Halfway to his house, they passed a small tea shop tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered ice cream stand, its windows fogged with warmth. Edwin stopped walking and suggested, with the enthusiasm of a much younger man, that the least he could do after borrowing a granddaughter for the morning was buy her a cup of tea. Chloe laughed and told him he didn't owe her anything, and he agreed easily, saying he simply wanted the company a little while longer. Inside, over Earl Grey for him and peppermint tea for her, the conversation drifted easily from his years in the classroom to her job at the little bakery on Elm Street, where customers assumed frosting cupcakes all day sounded relaxing until they tried explaining to her exactly what kind of cake they wanted without knowing the flavor, size, or occasion. Edwin laughed so hard at that he nearly knocked over his cup, and for a moment the strange sadness from the bank seemed to lift entirely from his face. Then he pulled out his phone, the screen cracked in one corner, and admitted he was trying to video call his grandson but couldn't make the picture work properly. Chloe watched as the camera pointed first at the ceiling, then at his own ear, then at nothing but the top of his silver head, and by the time he finally managed to aim it correctly, the phone had somehow sent an enormous animated dinosaur into a family group chat instead of dialing anyone at all. Edwin stared at the screen in genuine horror while Chloe laughed until her eyes watered, and a moment later the phone rang with a call from someone listed simply as Mason. Edwin looked at the screen, pressed the wrong button out of pure confusion, and hung up on his own grandson without meaning to. When Chloe asked if he should call back, he waved a hand and said Mason worried too much anyway, then added that he was currently having tea with his granddaughter and didn't wish to be interrupted. Across town, Mason Carraway stared at his silent phone with a frown that had nothing to do with the spreadsheet still open on his computer screen. His grandfather never ignored calls, not since the promise he'd made after his last dizzy spell to always answer or call right back within minutes. Mason grabbed his coat before the second ring had even finished echoing in his mind, already dialing the bank, already imagining the worst. The bank confirmed Edwin had left almost an hour earlier, and 3 phone calls to nearby cafes later, someone finally recognized the description and pointed him toward the little tea shop on Birch Street. Mason pushed through the door with snow still clinging to his shoulders and found his grandfather laughing harder than he'd heard him laugh in months, sitting across from a young woman Mason had never seen in his life. Relief and confusion crashed into each other on his face at the same time. Edwin spotted him first and stood, beaming, introducing Chloe with the same pride he might have used for a lifelong member of the family. Mason's eyes moved slowly from his grandfather to the stranger and back again, and he said, carefully, that his grandfather did not have a granddaughter. Edwin simply lifted his teacup and looked entirely too pleased with himself for a man who'd just been caught in an obvious lie. A few minutes later, Mason pulled Chloe aside near the door, his voice low, apologizing if the question sounded strange, but needing to know exactly who she was and why his 82-year-old grandfather had introduced her as family. Chloe glanced back through the window at Edwin, who was cheerfully waving at them both like nothing unusual had happened at all, and told Mason it was a much longer story than he'd probably believe standing on a cold sidewalk. He listened without interrupting as she explained the bank, the strange request, the 5 minutes that had somehow stretched into an entire afternoon. By the time she finished, the suspicion in his gray eyes had faded into something closer to embarrassment, and he apologized for assuming the worst about a stranger who had clearly done nothing but show his grandfather kindness on a hard morning. Chloe folded her arms and told him not to worry, that she was getting used to being misjudged before lunch. That evening, driving them both home, Edwin insisted on sitting in the back seat because his knee was apparently bothering him, despite complaining about his shoulder earlier that same morning. Mason caught Chloe's raised eyebrow in the rearview mirror and admitted, half amused, that his grandfather's ailments tended to migrate depending on what arrangement he was trying to engineer. From the back seat, without opening his eyes, Edwin informed them both that he could hear every word they were saying. Over the following weeks, what should have been a single strange morning slowly stretched into something neither of them had planned. Edwin called when he wanted company on his walks through the park, when the batteries in his television remote had somehow ended up upside down again, and once simply because the grocery store carried 6 different kinds of tomatoes and he refused to trust a delivery app to choose correctly on his behalf. Chloe found herself saying yes almost every time, and Mason found himself showing up more often than his work calendar strictly allowed. One Saturday, Edwin insisted on a walk through the park despite the wind, bundled in his heaviest scarf, pointing out which trees he'd climbed as a boy and which bench he'd once proposed to Josephine on nearly 60 years before. Snow fell in slow, lazy flakes that caught in Chloe's braid and melted against her cheeks, and Edwin told her, almost offhand, that watching her laugh reminded him of the sound his own house used to make before it went quiet. She didn't know what to say to that, so she simply linked her arm through his and matched her steps to his slower ones the rest of the way home. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, while helping Edwin sort through boxes in the attic, that Chloe first noticed something wasn't quite right. A carved wooden clock that had sat on the mantel for as long as Edwin could remember was simply gone, along with a small collection of old coins he'd kept in a cigar box since childhood. When she asked about them, Edwin's easy smile faded, and he admitted, almost embarrassed, that a financial consultant named Vince Draper had suggested selling a few unnecessary items to simplify his estate. Chloe had never heard the name before, but something about the way Edwin said it, carefully and without much conviction, made her uneasy. A week later, she finally met Vince Draper in person when he arrived at Edwin's house in a sharp navy suit and an expensive watch that caught the winter light every time he moved his wrist. His smile was warm and practiced, the kind that never quite reached his eyes, and he spoke about Edwin's finances with the easy confidence of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. Draper explained, smoothly and at length, that Edwin's old farmhouse property sat on land a resort development company was eager to purchase, and that with a few simple signatures, Edwin could finally stop worrying about upkeep and taxes on a house far too large for one man alone. He mentioned power of attorney almost casually, tucked between compliments about Edwin's sharp memory and reassurances that everything was purely precautionary. Chloe watched Edwin nod along, trusting and tired, and something cold settled low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather outside. A few days before that unsettling visit, Edwin had called Chloe with an emergency that turned out to be 6 different varieties of tomatoes lined up at the grocery store, each one apparently more suspicious than the last. She stood in the produce aisle for nearly 20 minutes explaining the difference between vine-ripened and Roma while snow melted off her boots onto the tile. And when she finally asked why he hadn't just asked Mason, Edwin simply said he preferred having options, and that having her opinion was one of them. It was a small, silly afternoon, the kind that meant nothing on its own, except that it was one of dozens by then, each one stitching her a little further into the rhythm of his days without either of them noticing. 2 weeks after that, Edwin asked her to come along to a cardiology follow-up because Mason had a client meeting he couldn't move, and though Edwin waved it off as nothing serious, Chloe noticed the flicker of disappointment cross his face before he covered it with a joke about doctors and their endless waiting rooms. Mason arrived just as the appointment ended, his tie crooked and his breath still short from jogging in from the parking garage, apologizing twice before Edwin cut him off and told him the meeting had clearly been more important than sitting through a blood pressure cuff. The words weren't angry, but they landed heavier than anger would have, and Chloe watched something tighten behind Mason's eyes that told her the guilt of that missed afternoon wouldn't leave him easily. That night, she told Mason everything: the missing clock, the coins, the smooth-talking stranger who kept appearing at his grandfather's kitchen table with folders full of documents. Mason went quiet in the way he did when he was genuinely frightened rather than merely annoyed, and admitted that Draper had approached him 2 weeks earlier, suggesting that Mason co-sign paperwork to make things easier on everyone. He'd refused without thinking twice, but now he wondered how many other papers his grandfather had signed alone at that same kitchen table. Together, they began digging, carefully at first, pulling old bank statements and comparing signatures on documents Edwin barely remembered agreeing to. Several signatures looked slightly wrong, the letters too smooth, too consistent, nothing like Edwin's genuinely shaky handwriting on the birthday cards still taped inside his kitchen cabinet. A call to the bank confirmed what they had both started to fear, that a power of attorney form had been filed weeks earlier, granting Vince Draper significant control over Edwin's accounts and property decisions. Chloe drove straight to Edwin's house that afternoon and found him in the garden despite the cold, carefully wrapping burlap around Josephine's old rose bushes the way he did every winter without fail. She told him gently what they'd found, watching his face crumble first with confusion and then with something far heavier, a slow and painful understanding that the friendly man who brought him coffee and compliments had been slowly emptying his life out from underneath him for months. Before Mason ever reached Draper's office, Draper found Chloe first, walking into the little bakery on Elm Street on a Tuesday morning wearing that same practiced smile and ordering a coffee he clearly had no intention of drinking. He complimented the bakery, complimented her patience with the Caraway family, and then, almost gently, suggested that outsiders who inserted themselves into an elderly man's finances sometimes found their own lives complicated in return, mentioning her landlord and her modest savings account with a precision that felt far too deliberate to be casual conversation. Chloe kept her voice steady and told him she wasn't afraid of him, though her hands trembled slightly around the counter rag long after he'd walked back out into the cold. And it was that visit, more than anything else, that convinced her Draper wasn't simply careless with paperwork. He was dangerous to anyone who got in his way. Mason confronted Draper directly 2 days later at his office downtown, laying the mismatched signatures and bank records across the desk between them. For a long moment, Draper's composure slipped, his easy smile tightening at the corners, before he recovered and calmly agreed to withdraw the power of attorney filing, blaming a paperwork error and promising everything would be corrected within the week. Mason left the office feeling like he'd won, certain the danger had passed, certain his grandfather was safe again. He was wrong, and the truth arrived 4 days later in the form of a certified letter announcing a court hearing to determine Edwin's mental competency, requested not by Draper directly, but by a shell corporation Draper had secretly created with the Resort Development Company as its only client. Attached was a psychological evaluation, dated and signed, claiming Edwin showed clear signs of cognitive decline, an evaluation from a doctor none of them had ever met and Edwin had certainly never visited. Chloe felt the floor tilt beneath her when Mason read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, Edwin sitting silently between them with the old passbook clutched in his lap like it might anchor him to something solid. If the court ruled against him, guardianship would pass to an appointed conservator, one Draper had almost certainly already arranged, giving him full legal access to sell the farmhouse property before anyone could stop him. The hearing was scheduled for 6 days away, and a heavy winter storm warning had already begun crawling across every local weather report. Edwin insisted, calm but unwavering, that he wasn't afraid of a courtroom, but Chloe noticed his hands trembling slightly around his teacup that evening, the tremor small enough to hide from a stranger, but impossible to hide from someone who had spent weeks learning every version of his smile. Mason spent every spare hour after that gathering evidence, bank timestamps, the real doctor's office records proving Edwin's actual cognitive testing from the year before had come back completely normal, and a sworn statement from the honest young bank teller who remembered every strange visit Draper had made asking questions about Edwin's balance. 3 days before the hearing, while helping Edwin water the roses despite doctor's orders about overexertion in the cold, the old man suddenly sat down hard in the snow, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Chloe screamed for Mason, who came running from the driveway and drove faster than he'd ever driven in his life, reaching the hospital in what felt like minutes, though it must have been longer. The doctor called it stress-related, his heart simply overwhelmed by weeks of fear he'd been carrying alone so as not to worry either of them. Sitting in the hospital hallway that night, Mason finally admitted out loud what he'd been afraid to say for years, that he'd spent so long building his company that he'd nearly missed watching his grandfather grow old, and that he had almost let a stranger in an expensive suit take away the only family he had left simply because he'd been too busy to notice the warning signs sooner. Chloe rested her hand over his without a word, and for once neither of them needed to fill the silence with anything at all. It was while cleaning out Edwin's nightstand drawer to bring him fresh clothes for the hospital that Chloe found the old cream envelope, tucked beneath a stack of folded handkerchiefs, addressed to no one and sealed for what looked like years. Inside was a letter in Edwin's careful, looping handwriting, written not for a bank or a courtroom, but for Mason, full of things Edwin had apparently never found the courage to say out loud since the accident that took Mason's parents so many years before. She didn't read it, only carried it carefully to the hospital and placed it in Mason's hands without explanation. He read it alone by the window while his grandfather slept, and by the time Chloe returned with coffee, his eyes were red and his hands were shaking, though not from fear this time. Edwin had written, years earlier, that he was proud of the man Mason had become despite everything they'd both lost, that he sometimes forgot to say the important things out loud because his own father had taught him that men simply didn't, and that he hoped Mason would learn to say things sooner than he ever had. The night before the hearing, the storm the weather reports had warned about finally arrived in full force, burying Maple Hollow under nearly a foot of snow within a few hours and knocking out power along half the county. Mason spent the night on the phone convincing the real bank teller, snowed in 20 miles away, that her testimony mattered enough to risk the roads in the morning, while Chloe sat with Edwin in the hospital, reading old lesson plans aloud from his teaching years just to keep his mind somewhere warm. By morning, the plows had barely cleared a single lane through town, but the teller arrived anyway, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too large, carrying printed statements and a small flash drive of security footage showing Draper alone at the counter asking pointed questions about accounts that weren't his own. The real doctor arrived shortly after, his own records in hand, ready to testify that the evaluation attached to Draper's filing had never come from his office and bore a signature that wasn't even close to his own. The courtroom that morning was half empty because of the storm, but every seat that mattered was filled. Edwin sat beside Mason at the front table, still pale from the hospital, but sitting straight-backed in his best gray suit, the old passbook resting on the table in front of him like a small, stubborn flag. Vince Draper sat across the aisle in a suit even sharper than usual, his composure perfectly intact, clearly expecting an easy formality rather than a fight. The judge called the hearing to order, and Draper's attorney began smoothly, describing an elderly man in gentle decline, a family too distracted to notice, and a conservator ready to step in purely out of concern for Edwin's well-being. Mason's attorney rose next, calm and unhurried, and asked simply whether the evaluation on file had ever actually been performed, sliding the real doctor's sworn statement across the table before Draper's side had finished objecting. The real doctor testified clearly, his voice steady, that he had never examined Edwin Carraway for the report bearing his name, and that the signature on the document was not his own. A murmur rippled through the small courtroom as the judge examined both signatures side by side, and Draper's easy composure cracked for the first time, a thin line of sweat visible at his temple despite the cold outside. Draper's attorney tried once more before the tide fully turned, suggesting to the judge that Chloe herself was a stranger who had inserted herself into an elderly man's life with suspicious speed, hinting that her presence at the bank that first morning had been convenient rather than accidental. Chloe felt her face go hot with anger rather than embarrassment, and before Mason's attorney could object, Edwin rose from his seat on his own, insisting the judge let him answer that particular accusation himself. He said plainly that he had approached Chloe, not the other way around, that he alone had asked a stranger for 5 minutes of kindness on a hard morning, and that if wanting to protect the woman who gave him those 5 minutes made him incompetent, then the whole courtroom was welcome to lock him up for it. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery, and even the judge allowed the corner of her mouth to lift before calling the room back to order. Then the bank teller took the stand, and Chloe watched from the gallery as the young woman calmly described Draper's repeated visits asking about Edwin's balance without Edwin present, his questions about how quickly funds could be transferred, and the security footage time-stamped weeks before the power of attorney form had supposedly been signed with Edwin's full understanding and consent. The footage played on a small screen, silent but damning, showing Draper alone at the counter with documents Edwin had never seen that day at all. Mason stood next, and instead of reciting figures or dates, he spoke about a man who had raised him after his parents died, who taught 7th graders about history for 40 years and still remembered every student's name, who forgot where he left his glasses but never once forgot to ask how someone else's day had gone. He said that a man capable of that kind of memory and that kind of kindness did not need to be protected from his own mind. He needed to be protected from people who preyed on kindness for profit. Edwin was asked at last to speak for himself, and he rose slowly, steadying himself on the table for just a moment before standing straight. He said, plainly, that he had signed papers he didn't fully understand because he trusted a man who spoke kindly and smiled often, and that trusting people had never once been his weakness, only theirs for using it against him. The judge, listening closely, noted for the record that the man before her showed no sign whatsoever of the confusion the false evaluation had claimed. It took the judge less than 20 minutes to dismiss the guardianship petition entirely, to void the fraudulent power of attorney, and to refer the entire matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into forgery and elder financial fraud. Vince Draper was escorted out through a side door as reporters who had heard about the case began gathering outside despite the weather, his composed smile finally completely gone. Outside, the snow kept falling, softer now, as though the storm itself had finally decided to ease. News of the case spread through Maple Hollow faster than the snowplows could clear the roads, and within days it reached beyond the county entirely, other families coming forward with their own stories about Draper's shell companies and quiet paperwork. Edwin, once he was fully recovered, found himself something of a local legend, stopped constantly at the grocery store and the hardware store by people wanting to shake his hand or simply tell him how glad they were the whole ordeal had ended the way it had. At the feed store on Route 9, old Hank Doyle, who had known Edwin since they were boys fishing the same creek together, told anyone who would listen that he'd always said Edwin Carraway had the sharpest mind in 3 counties, and that any judge with eyes could see it plain as day. Hank had driven through the worst of the storm himself just to sit in that half-empty courtroom, and when Edwin thanked him for coming out in such weather, Hank only shrugged and said that was what neighbors did for each other, storm or no storm, and that he'd have walked if his truck hadn't started. Edwin waved off the praise every time someone repeated the story, though Chloe noticed he stood a little taller each time it happened, the weeks of quiet fear slowly draining out of his shoulders. Life in the house on Birch Street began to feel steady again, Sunday breakfast stretching lazily into afternoons, Mason leaving the office earlier than he ever used to, Edwin's roses recovering under fresh burlap as the worst of winter finally began to loosen its grip. Chloe became such a fixture in the Carraway household that she stopped bothering to call ahead before showing up, simply letting herself in through the kitchen door the way family does, and neither of the men ever once complained about it. Then one gray afternoon in late February, an email arrived that changed the quiet rhythm they had all settled into. A bakery in Burlington, well known and well respected, had offered Chloe a formal apprenticeship, the exact kind of opportunity she had once dreamed about before Maple Hollow had somehow, unexpectedly, become home. She read it twice at the kitchen table, her smile appearing and disappearing so quickly that Edwin noticed immediately and asked what was wrong even though nothing, technically, was wrong at all. She told him the truth, that it was wonderful news and also somehow the worst timing imaginable, and Edwin listened without offering easy comfort, only asking gently whether her heart already knew what it wanted even if her mouth hadn't caught up yet. Upstairs, unaware of the conversation happening below him, Mason had just walked past the open kitchen door and heard only a single word drift up the stairwell, Burlington, and it settled into his chest like a stone dropped through thin ice. For the next several days, Mason found himself rehearsing sentences he never quite managed to say out loud, watching Chloe laugh with his grandfather over breakfast and feeling the calendar tick down toward an ending he wasn't ready for. He thought often about the letter still folded in his jacket pocket, about his grandfather's careful handwriting warning him not to wait too long to say the things that mattered, and about how easily a person could repeat the exact mistakes of the people who raised them. The morning Chloe finally left for Burlington, a light snow was falling again, soft and unhurried, nothing like the storm that had nearly cost them everything weeks before. Edwin insisted on coming to the train station despite the cold, wrapped in his heaviest coat, and Mason drove them both in near silence, glancing at Chloe in the rearview mirror every few minutes as though trying to memorize the exact color of her eyes before the train pulled away. At the platform, families hugged goodbye around them, a conductor's voice echoing through the loudspeaker announcing boarding times, and Edwin reached into his coat pocket to press something small into Chloe's hands before she could board. It was the old passbook, worn soft at the corners from years of handling, and tucked inside its cover was the same letter Mason had once read alone in a hospital hallway, one new line added beneath his grandfather's careful script in Mason's own handwriting. Chloe unfolded the paper slowly while snow gathered gently on her shoulders, and read Mason's added words near the bottom, a simple sentence promising that if she ever found someone worth staying for, he hoped she wouldn't make him wait either. She looked up to find Mason already standing closer than he had a moment before, his gray eyes steady despite the cold, and he said, low and certain, that Burlington could wait a little longer if she wanted it to, but that he needed her to know he didn't want her to give it up for him. He told her he only wanted to earn the right to walk beside her wherever her dream eventually took her, and that he was done being the kind of man who let the people who mattered most disappear because he was too afraid or too busy to say so out loud. The station around them seemed to fall away entirely, the announcements and the cold and the crowd, until there was only the sound of snow falling softly around, two people finally saying what they meant. Chloe smiled, glancing once at Edwin, who was pretending very unconvincingly to study the arrivals board while wiping at his eyes with one gloved hand. She told Mason that his grandfather had once said something to her too, on the very first morning they'd met, that some things are easier when people believe someone is waiting for them, and that she didn't want someone merely waiting anymore. She wanted someone walking straight through the snow beside her instead. Edwin, still pretending to study the arrivals board, muttered under his breath that he had been waiting for this exact conversation since the day he first spotted her standing in that crowded bank line, and that the tomatoes, the phone calls, and the endless walks through the park had all, admittedly, been part of a very deliberate plan. Chloe laughed through the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes and told him his plan had very nearly gotten her fired for standing around a produce aisle for 20 minutes at a time. He asked, almost laughing with relief, if that meant she was staying, and she answered that some opportunities were worth chasing, but some people were worth chasing even more, and that she'd already found the second kind. The train pulled away from the platform a few minutes later, empty of the passenger everyone had expected it to carry, while Edwin slipped his arm through both of theirs and declared, with great satisfaction, that he had personally arranged the entire thing from the very beginning. Vince Draper spent the following weeks awaiting trial while investigators combed through years of similar filings, discovering that Edwin's near miss had been far from an isolated case. 3 other elderly residents in the county had signed away portions of their savings under nearly identical circumstances, each one flattered and reassured by the same practiced smile, each one too proud or too frightened to speak up until Edwin's story finally gave them the courage to come forward. Spring eventually came to Maple Hollow, slow and reluctant as it always was in Vermont, but it came all the same, and Edwin's roses bloomed fuller that year than either of the boys who tended them beside him could ever remember. Vince Draper's trial ended in a conviction on multiple counts of fraud, and 3 other elderly residents of the county recovered property and savings they had feared lost forever because of the case Edwin had been brave enough to fight. On a warm afternoon in early June, Chloe married Mason in Edwin's backyard beneath Josephine's rose arbor, exactly the kind of small, warm wedding Edwin swore his late wife would have insisted on herself. Hank Doyle gave a toast that ran 20 minutes longer than anyone expected, and Edwin cried without any embarrassment at all, sitting in the front row with the old passbook resting in his lap one final time. Every Sunday after that, the 3 of them still gathered around the same kitchen table, Edwin still introducing Chloe as his favorite granddaughter no matter how many times Mason reminded him she was, in fact, his wife. Edwin would simply butter another piece of toast and say it made no difference to him at all, and Chloe eventually stopped trying to win that particular argument, because some things, she had learned, were simply worth losing on purpose. Josephine's rose arbor had never looked fuller than it did that June, thick with pale pink blooms that Edwin swore had never grown so generously in all the years before. He liked to tell anyone who would listen that his wife had always claimed roses grew best where love was paid attention to, and that between Mason's stubborn devotion and Chloe's endless fussing over the soil, the garden simply had no choice but to bloom the way it finally did that spring. Sometimes the greatest families aren't the ones we're born into. They're the ones built out of 5 borrowed minutes at a bank counter, out of kindness offered to a stranger with nothing to gain from it, and out of the courage to keep showing up long after it would have been easier to walk away. Edwin often said that winter had taught him that lesson best of all, that the coldest season strips everything down until only the truest things are left standing, and that sometimes it takes a little snow to show you exactly who was never planning to leave. If this story warmed you even a little, tell us in the comments whether you would have said yes to Edwin at that bank counter, and don't forget to subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next story waiting for you. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Take care of the people who show up for you without being asked, and we'll see you in the next story.